So 3 problems that might be involved in cutting toilet paper on Shabbos. One of them is mechatech. That's maybe the one that we would think of most naturally. What does mechatech mean? Mechatech means cutting something into pieces that have a certain measure that you want to be, you have some item or some fabric which is too big and you want to cut it to size. That's the melacha of mechatech. We'll see about that in just a minute. The other issue that we would think of immediately is korea, tearing, right? There's a melacha of tearing on Shabbos, and when you tear the toilet paper, that seems to be a problem of korea, tearing, right? We have mechatech, we have korea, and potentially we also have makabapatish. What's makabapatish? Creating something that will be useful. You can't use a roll of toilet paper, but you can use pieces of it. Maybe you can use a roll by hitting. Ben. Sorry. Take them out. You can use it for a certain purpose. You can use a toilet roll for hitting someone over the head with it. However, it's not a kli. It's not a kli. You can use some say, yeah, you could use it as a paperweight. So it's a kli, but it's a very weak use. Sounds like you have experience with this. However, for generally speaking, this is not some activity for kids in GAN, or you can be creative, but without cutting it, it doesn't really have a use that you think of immediately. So these are the 3 issues: mechatech, korea, and makabapatish. So let's begin. The makuras that I've given out are specific to mechatech, and then afterwards we'll get to other makuras in Hashem shortly. So on page 1, we have the basic sources for the melacha of mechatech. Okay, mechatech. Look at the source at the top. This is Shabbos Tafayin Dalet. Amar Avashi, Ikapid amishchasa amishchasa chayav mishum mechatech. It means if you cut pieces of leather, and Rashi says Ikapid amishchasa the chaytchan b'midah. Okay, if you want to cut pieces of leather, Rashi says mechatech haor mechatech say b'midah. Okay, you're cutting something to size. You need it for a certain size to use for whichever construction you use. And this is what we learn out in the Mishnah, the Mishnah in Perek Al-Gada. The Mishnah says that one of the melachos, one of the 3rd is a melacha, mechatech is another melacha, and it's learned out from the Mishkan, from the creation of the Mishkan, that they needed to cut these bits of leather. That's the melacha of mechatech. Now, the other examples of mechatech in the Gemara are very fascinating. The second source you have here, Ein Hayamid base, says Hamagare. Look at the underlined part in the middle. Hamagare roishe kulunsais b'Shabbos chayav mishum mechatech. Okay, what does that mean?
Yeah. So wait, what do we decide? Am I taking her now or not?
And the Gemara tells us that someone who cuts these beams in order to make them all equal. Rashi says, okay, you've got these beams like a fence around your garden, and you want to shave off the top of the beams so they'll all be nice and sharp, nice and uniform. They'll all be the same. It says Rashi, that's also chayav mishum.
Okay, go do your thing.
Chayav mishum mechatech. And down the very bottom, the very bottom source on Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis. This is in Maseches Beitza. Over there it says. Right. This is a sugya that's speaking about the samim. Okay, it's talking about you are taking a stalk or a a certain plant that you're going to cut down to size, and there it says, you're allowed to cut it up and to smell, right? Once you cut whatever leaf it is or whichever item it is, then it will give off a certain smell, right? But by cutting it, you'll be able to smell it. And Bamedva, remember rakim, that's if it's soft. Aval bekatin, aval bekashin, excuse you, lo yiktemelu, vim kat my pata aval also. Right, you're not allowed to cut it, and if you do cut it, then pata aval also lachtet beshinov. However, you can't use it as a toothpick, right? You mustn't use it as a toothpick. And over here, this halacha is paskin in the Shulchan Aruch, and the problem here is what? The problem here isn't machatich. The problem here is a problem of makabeh patish, of actually creating something. You've created a toothpick, right? And by cutting it to size, you've created a toothpick, and that's a problem of makabeh patish. So we have a variety of sugyas that speak about cutting something to size. We've seen some that speak about machatich. Over here, we see one that speaks about makabeh patish. This is based on the Mishnah in Beitza. The Mishnah is just about litzles by maliach. You mustn't cut paper to use it for maliach. And over there also, the problem is not a problem of machatich, like we'll see in a minute. It's a problem of makabeh patish. So, what's the general rule? When is cutting something to size a problem of machatich, and when isn't it a problem of machatich? Do we have a problem of machatich whenever we want to, for example, when we want to take a well, cutting food. Okay, cutting food is a good question. Cutting food is a good question.
Anything that is not exactly shaveh, you're not cutting it to make it exactly like that. So maybe that would be mitzvah.
Well,
we can be medayik from that.
Well, again, we'll see in a moment. But this, I just want to point out, it's relevant to many things that we would do on a kind of everyday level, not just the questions of toilet paper, which we'll discuss in due course. But for example, when we're opening different things and we want to cut, let's think of a good example, things that we cut in order to have something as a convenient size. Let's say, food is an example. Okay, we want to cut something to have it as a convenient size. Aluminium foil is a good example. You want to cut some aluminium foil in order to wrap something up with a foil. That's an excellent example. Right. Well, what about if you want to cut, let's say you've got these containers, you buy a bag of something, and they have a perforated line that you want to cut across the perforated line, and because that makes a good cut, a good size, right? Why do they put a perforated line where they put it? Because it's a convenient size to take out the food, right? Would that be a problem of machatich? Opening a can on Shabbos, right? A can of drink, right? So you open a can, it makes a cut, it makes an incision, right? It cuts. That cut is a very specific size. Why is it made that size? Because that's the ideal size to drink. I'm sure this has been researched, right? So are you allowed to open a can, or would that be a problem of machatich, right? And so on. One could think of other machatich. What's considered machatich and what isn't. So let's have a look at the Rambam on this. There's several other sources we could consider, but the Rambam gives a fairly clear definition of when is something called machatich and when isn't it. And if you look at the Rambam, it's in Perek Yudalef of Shabbos, it's on page 2 over here. And the Rambam says, "Hamachatich in halacha zayin. Hamachatich min ha'or." Again, he's quoting the Gemara that we saw before in Ayin Daled. Hamachatich min ha'or kedei lazes kameh chayes. If you cut leather in order to make a kameh for it, which presumably has to be a certain size, then chayav. But the Rambam goes on and explains, V'hu sheiskavein lemidas orkoi umidas rochboi. Only if you intend to cut this piece of parchment or piece of leather at a certain length and a certain width, meaning you want this to be 15 centimeters by 10 centimeters, okay? And you have to cut it with intention of that specific measure, right? Shehi melochos, that's the melochos, meaning you need to be cutting it to a certain size that you want that size specifically. That's derech hefsed. If you cut it in a way which is derech hefsed, meaning you're ruining it by cutting it, right? This is what many poskim speak about, for example, with opening a bag of crisps or something. It's derech hefsed, right? You're not fixing the bag, you're destroying the bag by cutting it open. Over there, the melacha that's often discussed is korea, but it's the same principle. Derech hefsed, bli kavana lemidasei. Or if you don't have intention for the size of it, you don't care what size it is, right? You just do it, but it just comes out that way, right? Or you're doing it for play, then hareza potter. Then you don't have the melacha, at least on the Doraisa level, you don't have the melacha of mechatech. So the Rambam's telling us that mechatech is when you have an intention of having a specific size, right? It has to be something which is a specific size, 10 by 15. And what about the Gemara? We saw the Gemara that says that also when you want to shave down those beams of wood and you want them right for your fence, and you want them to all be uniform, carries on, and he says, he quotes another Gemara that we didn't see, but it's the same principle. How does it tell us if you have a feather from a bird and you want to use it as a quill, and you take something off which is a specific part of it that needs to be cut down to size, then it's told us mechatev v'chayev v'chein magared roshei kluntzos. That's our case of these beams of wood. Shel erez chayev mishem mechatev. Also there you are chayev, meaning this is the full Doraisa level, the Torah level of mechatev. So we find in the Rambam here that the definition of the melacha is cutting something to size. However, it doesn't have to be a size that you necessarily know. You don't know how high these beams are, but you know that you want it to be a precise measure, that each beam should be the same as the other one. So when you want it to be a precise measure, even if you don't know, right? You don't know that it might be 1.25 meters or something, but you don't know how tall it is. Doesn't make a difference. If you want to cut something to size and you're interested in a specific size, whether it's a size that you know you want 10 by 15 centimeters, or whether it's something which is precise because of the arrangement that you're interested in, because that's how you want your fence to look, then either one of those cases is chayev mishum mechatech. So that's how the Rambam learns, and the chinuch in the source right below, the chinuch says as follows. He asks the question. This is a minchas chinuch, excuse me. The chinuch says more or less the same as the Rambam, and the minchas chinuch asks, well, what about psik reisha? Let's say you're not interested in the precise size, but it comes out precisely what you wanted. Isn't that going to be a problem of mechatech? So the Minchas Chinuch says no. And he says HaKlal, the third line of the Minchas Chinuch, says HaKlal, the melacha zoi, eina rak b'miskaven lemeda. This melacha only applies when you have intention for a certain dimension. If you don't have that intention, then it doesn't apply. If you don't have the intention, it's nothing if you don't have that intention. It says, right? It's only called a labor of Shabbos when you have the intention of cutting something to a specific size. If you don't have that intention, then it's not a melacha at all. I would add, it's misasik, meaning the fact that it comes out like that isn't interesting to us, because that's not what you're doing. You're involved in something else. You're involved in cutting something. That act of cutting is not an act of melochos mechatech. It's cutting, which might be perfectly mutter on Shabbos. Like if you cut your cucumber, right, like David mentioned before, that's fine. There's no problem of cutting cucumbers on Shabbos. The fact that it comes out to a 2.3 centimeters, which is exactly what you wanted, that's not going to be any problem of on Shabbos. In addition to that, with foods, because it's not considered mechatech, you want it convenient to eat. However, even when we're speaking about something which ostensibly is mechatech, right? You're happy that the hole in your can is a certain measure, and we'll see later on. Happens to be a machlokes about whether that's called mechatech or not. But there's a lot of room, it would seem to suggest, that wouldn't be called mechatech. And why not? Because you're not interested in the size. You're not interested in the precision. You want this can to be open because you want to drink something from within the can. The way of opening it is to break it open the way the manufacturers made it. This is not mechatech. You're not interested now in cutting something down to size. Avi. No, that's just what you're interested in eating. That's nothing to do with mechatech. You want to eat this and you don't want to eat that, so that's fine. Mechatech is when you want the middle, you want the dimension. With food, you never really want a dimension, but you're not interested in it. You're right that you'd get it, but you're not interested in it. You just want to eat the carrot. You want to eat it ground up, but you're not interested in dimensions. And therefore, that's a problem of teichen, there's a problem of grinding. But that's not a dimensioned issue. And therefore, there's no problem of mechatech when you're not interested in the specific dimension. If you we're not going to be able to do all the sources, unfortunately. However, let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is in Siman Shin Chav Beis, Dinei Noilad actually, which is related to the last source that we saw. If you remember, we had a source about something that creates a smell, something that creates a scent, and whether you're allowed to cut something up that's going to create a scent, to create a smell. So the Shulchan Aruch says as follows. He says, "Achle behema ein be mishum tikun kli," right? If you're cutting this up, something which is suitable as food for an animal, something which is animal food, even if it's not intended for animal food, right? The Gemara there speaking about pieces of wood or pieces of wherever they come from, certain plants. So there's no problem of tikkun kli and cutting them, and therefore mutter liktoim, you're allowed to cut it up, you're allowed to chop it down, right? Afilu b'sakin, even with a knife, if it's cash or teven, straw or whatever it is, and to use it as a toothpick, right? Velachtet peishinov, and this is not considered a tikkun kli. The Mishnah Berurah has a discussion over here about what type of kli exactly you're creating, but it's not our discussion, so not going to get into it now. The interesting thing is that what about if you want it to be a certain size? So the Mishnah Berurah says in Yud Beis at the bottom, even if you want a specific size, right? Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Because it's food. So the Mishnah Berurah is saying something else. Apart from what we've spoken about before, Mishnah Berurah is saying that when we have something which is food, then it leaves the entire category of mechatech. Mechatech is about something which you would do in a hardware store. It's about cutting something off which is a material, something which we're going to use in building, something which we're going to use in a material sense. But when it's food, where generally speaking, when you see someone cutting up food, you don't think, oh, he's cutting this to make some kind of a to use it, to cut it down to a specific size, then even if you intend it as a specific size, that's not enough to define it as mechatech. It's a wonderful chiddush that mechatech, there are certain things that it just doesn't apply to. Like we find, for example, that certain melochos, when you do them on your body, it's not considered a melocha. You're allowed to grind something in your mouth, right? Why are you allowed to grind it in your mouth? There's a problem of grinding, it's teichen. The answer is that grinding with your mouth is never classified as teichen because it's classified as eating and not as teichen. So also here with food, even if you are interested in the 2 centimeters, that's not called mechatech. So that's well, again, you're right that it wasn't similar, but the question is in which sense? In the Meshkan, let's say it was leather. However, that doesn't mean that paper doesn't have a problem with mechatech. The question is, what do you compare it to? It needs to have a reason for why it's different. And says the Mishnah, when it's food, then it's a different story. Right. So that would not be any problem of mechatech. That might be a problem if Falk wants to argue that would be a problem of kosev, of writing. Because, yeah, making it just like you're not allowed to write, you're also not allowed to draw pictures on Shabbos. And maybe this, I'm sorry? This is the question. This is the question. The Ramah speaks about this the other way around, right? Cutting up writing, is that considered erasing? Right? Is that considered erasing? It's not ksiva, for sure it's not ksiva d'oraisa because it's temporary. But that would be the question. Not our topic tonight. We'll dedicate another week to speak about that. So that's the Shulchan Aruch, and I just want to point out that because there isn't much in the Shulchan Aruch about mechatech, the Mishnah Berurah decides to use this springboard in Siman Shin Chaf Beis to speak about chituch. Sometimes the Mishnah Berurah does this here and there. He says, now that this has come to our hands, let's talk about it, right? So the Mishnah Berurah does this over here, and this is on page 3. It's about, I guess, 2/3 down in the column of the Mishnah Berurah, and you see it's underlined V'agav da'ayrin and v'shulchan aruch. Do you see that? But that small. V'agav, you see this? It's the underlined part. He says V'agav da'ayrin and v'shulchan aruch leinen chituch uktima. Because the Shulchan Aruch spoke about this, natik nami b'zeh din melochos mechatech. Let's talk about mechatech a bit. All right, so this is something which we would otherwise find difficulty finding because the Mishnah Berurah just puts it in as a by the way. And then he says, first of all, mechatech or, right? We saw this, leather. If it's wood, if it's metal, even if it's feathers, like we saw the example in the Rambam, if it's something that you want, a specific length, even if you don't know what that length is, but you want it to be specific, precise, he says. Okay, this is like we saw in the Rambam, and then further down, I'm not going to read the whole thing now. Further down he says, look at the base, 3 lines from the bottom, right? Like we said, foods, no mechatech. Food is out of bounds for melochos mechatech. And then he says, Gimel, right? Could you have mechatech even with something that you cut with your hand? It depends on each thing, depending on what it is. If it's normal to cut it with a kli, with a utensil, then if you cut it with your hand, that's going to be a shinui. That's not going to be mechatech. However, if it's something which you use your hands also to cut it, then there'd be an isur d'oraisa with your hands also, and the Mishnah Berurah says that one way or the other, you would have you would potentially have a d'Rabbanan. I won't get into it now because toilet paper, without any question, it's normal to cut with your hands, I assume. If you would cut it with a kli, that would be a shinui. That would be a shinui, and then it would only be d'Rabbanan. However, it would still be also d'Rabbanan because you're still doing the melocha of mechatech, but you're using a shinui. Okay. Lack of time. Let's get to toilet paper quickly, and then we'll speak about some other stuff. So, how do you look at cutting toilet paper? Says, yes, says. So, well, clearly it's not a clear-cut question, right? Because on the one hand, the manufacturers have designed it to be perforated on the most convenient size, right? That's otherwise they wouldn't have done it there unless they have some financial, economic issues here. I'm not sure, but clearly you can't use it as is. And if you do a very long piece, that's very inconvenient naturally. Right. You still use a double one, right? And what does that indicate? And that indicates that you don't care. So that's true. You're creating something which is usable, but that's a different problem. That's not a mechatech issue. And in the continuation of the Rambam, that's not mechatech. That's a problem of creating a kli. That's not a mechatech issue. Right. But you want two sheets, but you don't care if they're 10 centimeters or 12 centimeters. If they would have done the two sheets to be, I don't know, 17 centimeters instead of 12, whatever it is, I have no idea, you wouldn't care. So says Shlomo Zalman that cutting toilet paper does not have a problem of mechatech. Very interesting. Shlomo Zalman says there's no problem with mechatech for cutting toilet paper in Mincha Shlomo, and the reason why is because it's only for convenience. He said this is convenient. It's not a precise measure. I don't care about the exact size. It's just a question of convenience. No, it's not about the perforation, it's about the size, and it's because I don't care about the precise size. I just can't use an entire roll, and therefore I need to cut, and I don't want to waste money, so I need to cut it, but I don't care if it's this big or that big. No one cares so much. Well, that's interesting. But let me say that Rav Elyashiv agrees with you, and Rav Elyashiv says it's a d'oraisa of mechatech. Rav Elyashiv said, no way. Of course we care about the size, and you want this size because that's what you like, and the manufacturers know exactly what people like, and this is the size that you want, and therefore it's called mechatech, right? Let's say there's no perforations, right? It wouldn't make a difference. The question is, you want a precise size or not? Well, if if you take several sheets at once, then much, right? Cutting to size is still, it's in question. If you take too much, let's say you take 10 sheets instead of taking one, then you are, well, then, whatever, instead of two, okay, instead of two.
But it's a very broad range. But it's a very broad range.
I was about 2 sheets of 5 sheets.
No, anything, just not food. We'll speak about that in a minute. Which problem? Problem mechatek? Right, like we saw. Right, absolutely would be. Yeah, that's what we're speaking about having that size. If you want it. In the Rambam? No, here it's when you want the size. When you want the size, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well that's Shlomo Zalman's argument. So that's the question of. But by the way, good question. What happens? Let's say you're stuck, right? So you don't have any other options on Shabbos, and we'll speak about in a minute what can be done. But let's say you're stuck. So instead of cutting the size that you want, which is 2 or 3 or however many you want, you cut 10 instead, which is certainly what you don't want, right? So would that mean that it's no longer a melacha of mechatek, because now you're not cutting it to the size that you want? Or do we say that because this roll is made to be cut along the perforations in sizes that match what people want, then the fact that this particular action that you're doing is not the size that you want is not going to make a difference? Meaning you can't trick me with cutting too many pieces of toilet paper. The whole idea of cutting toilet paper is to cut to size. Just like we said on food is never a melacha. I would lean to say that if you cut a lot of toilet paper, that wouldn't be called mechatek. Even for those who are machmed to say like Rav Elyashiv, that is a mechatek. Now you're not cutting it to size, but it's a nice question to think about. However, we have some more questions to think about in a very short space of time. So let me speak very briefly about Korea and about Makabah Patish. Well, yeah, we're not going to get through all this now. Not 5 minutes. Thank you. Exactly. All right. So, and by the way, similar melochos about cutting along perforated lines. Shlomo Zalman says no problem, because you don't care about the exact size, you just want it to be convenient to get the food out. And others say no. Why do they make it exactly this perforation? Because very interesting that the different approaches here, and they come out from they derive or they emerge from this kind of inherent difficulty in defining, like what does it mean to care about size, to care about dimensions? How is that in our mindset? Do we subconsciously care or we don't? But certainly for food, I think anything related to food, I would really not worry about mechatek, because like the Rambam says, if it's something that happens by the way, then it's not called mechatek. Mechatek is when you intend to make the measurement. So cutting toilet paper, all right, there's room to discuss. But opening, some kind of a food packaging, I think it's much less of an issue to worry about. Let's speak very briefly about Korea, because Korea is another seemingly very significant problem with toilet paper. You're tearing, right? Korea is a melach on Shabbos of tearing. However, when the Rambam defines what is Korea, the Rambam speaks about the opposite of sewing, right? There's a melacha called tfira, sewing, And the opposite of sewing is korea, when you divide two things that are sewn together, right? Or stuck together maybe, right? When you divide them, then that's the melacha of korea. Now, Gemara says, korea is only chayev if it's korea al manas litvar, meaning only if the tearing is in a positive, in a productive way to help you to sew it together again later. Right? So just destruction. When you do it in a way of destruction, that's not a problem. The problem is when you're doing it in a way of fixing. Velcro is an excellent question. Generally speaking, poskim believes that Velcro is permitted under most circumstances because it's very transient, it's very temporary. But it's an excellent question because Velcro does stick together, right? And therefore, if it would be Velcro on a permanent level, that could be a real Pfeffer problem. However, generally speaking, Velcro is very temporary. It's very, it's made to open and close the whole time, like on your shoes and stuff like that, and then it would be fine. There's a question on the Sefer Torah thing, the Sefer Torah belt, when it's Velcro, and if it's from week to week, that might be a problem of Pfeffer. Not getting into it now. So what about toilet paper? Would that be a problem of korea? So first of all, very big question, and the Biur Halacha speaks about this. Over here, you're not separating two things. It's one piece of paper, one long roll of toilet paper, right? And you're tearing it into pieces. So you're not separating two things that were sewn together, right? They're not many little bits that were brought together to make this toilet paper, right? Rather, you're tearing it along its width, right? And you're making, instead of one long roll, you're making a bunch of smaller pieces. What would that fall under korea? So on the one hand, this is not destructive, right? This is constructive, meaning you want the papers for a purpose, right? But on the other hand, it's not separating two things. It's only one long block. And therefore, this is a big discussion. There's one in one place, the Mishnah Berurah mentions, in Shin Mem, the Mishnah Berurah mentions that, I guess they had toilet paper back then also. Maybe it was not quite the same as what we have, but they had some similar contraption. And the Mishnah Berurah mentions that there would be korea midoraisa. The Mishnah Berurah mentions that cutting toilet paper could be korea midoraisa. Others argue, the Chelkas Yaakov, for example, and others, they say no way. The Rambam says korea is only separating papers. If it's not separating two things that are sewn together, that can't be korea doraisa. So others argue with this. And the Tzitz Eliezer brings, and others bring, those who really argue with the Mishnah Berurah on this. However, the Mishnah Berurah does say that. And the third thing that we're not going to have time to discuss at all is creating something which will be useful. Like we saw, that when you cut something to create a kli that wasn't there before, that might also be a problem with our toilet paper. Let me just give you a bottom line, because we're not going to have more time for that. And that is, generally speaking, I think that, Rav Shlomo Zalman has a strong, I think it's a strong logic. I think that it's difficult to argue that cutting toilet paper is the full mechatech of caring about dimensions. Korea also, there's a tzad of a real isser, but again, because of the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like this wouldn't be the deraisa of Korea, and the Makabah Patish, even if there is certainly not a deraisa level Makabah Patish. We're not going to have time to get into it, but certainly not. And therefore, when you have when you just don't have any ready cut toilet paper, then on the other side of the scales, there's an issue of kvod habrius. And when there's an issue of kvod habrius, then there's room to be makel. Now, I'm sorry? Even on certain deraisas, not on the rest of the Shebel, like the Gemara says. So in this case, I saw, for example, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, he says that you can cut the toilet paper. However, he says you should cut it not along the perforated lines. Now, why is that? So, because if you cut it along the perforated lines, then it's b'derech tikkun. It's in a good way. It's in a positive way. you're creating these fine and useful and nice looking bits of toilet paper that will be handy for use. But if you cut it not along the perforated line, then it's not b'derech tikkun. And then you have less of a problem with the Rambam I mentioned about tearing, about Korea, but this is not the derech tikkun. By the way, Rav Yosef agrees that there's no mechatik. He says there's no issue of mechatik, like for Shlomo Zalman. And he says, under these circumstances, he says, cut not along the perforated line. Another possible option is to just leave on the roll, and then when you flush, it gets cut by itself. It depends if this is going to disturb other people or not, but it's possible. I haven't tried it, but I think it's probably possible. Yes, and if you do it with a shinui, that is, if you do it with a shinui, you can do it with your face. And that adds another level of leniency. It adds another leniency. So it adds a leniency because you're doing it in an irregular way. Now, I'm not saying you have to do this because, for example, Rav Yosef says that if you cut not along the perforated lines under these circumstances, you're okay. However, if you can add a shinui, then it's good. We like adding shinuyim when we're doing something on Shabbos. So it's handy.